All right. And we're all of the live that we can be. Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're taking some time, as we often do on Tuesdays, to break into some aspects and subjects of study regarding the work of an evangelist. Terry's with us again. He's back from his sojourn and his journeys, and it's good to have Terry back. I want to encourage everybody, if you have any questions right from the get-go, drop them into the comments. We'd love to interact with you. If you've got things that are important to you spiritually that are relevant to our discussion, or even things that would be of importance a little bit down the road and you want us to talk about them, let us know. So Terry, before we get into our study too much, how you doing? Everything okay?
Doing great. I happen to be back home after a long trip and without kids for a couple of days, which is always fantastic. So things are going really well.
Yeah, the house is a little quiet here. Our children, I think all of our children are elsewhere as well. Some of them are in the same spot, the same location. What we're going to break down today is an interesting connection that exists, and hopefully we can explain it in a very accessible way without using too much extra detail, perhaps. I know that sometimes when you start making some of these larger issues packageable, there's a bit of a challenge. And what we're going to discuss is some connections between the academic subject of social and economic geography and how that impacts local assemblies of Christians. Some of it is pretty easy to grasp. And so we've got three big ideas that we'll try to open up and include in our conversation today. And we're going to get right at it. And one of the things that's important to understand is however it was yesterday in your community has very little to do with today and tomorrow with these issues. There's a lot of great value from history and from community and from the background behavioral models of people, but that's not exactly what we're looking at here. And I'll begin with just a little brief, tiny tidbit of history lessons. We're going to pull some stuff from Texas, so all you Texans can get excited. We're going to talk about Texas. But here's something to think about. During one of the many oil booms, and there's been a few of them, there's many ones and big ones, a lot of towns in West Texas, and Texas in general, just suddenly exploded overnight with the increase in demand for oil. The price rose high enough at a per barrel price that everybody was like, drill, baby, drill. And so you had communities that were tiny before, and in a month, 2 months, they've got people going there in just droves. Time goes on, and the churches that are then maturing in those communities see the economy change. And all of those families go in a very logical and reasonable move and say, well, we need jobs, and we're not drilling like we used to. And so they spread everywhere. And then naturally, the churches that may have been 100, 200 members, 50, 75 members, are 5 to 15 members or 30 to 35 members. And people go, well, what happened? Well, change happened. And I want to talk about, to begin with, that that's okay. Those kind of changes have nothing to do with God's plan in that sense. It has nothing to do with your evangelistic capacity and everything to do with stuff you can't control. Terry, have you seen some of that yourself? I know I'm aware of that, and that's a great little history intro to it. Have you experienced that in your own work in certain areas?
Well, I have. I'll say a couple things in the church that I trained at a long time ago, 22 years ago. That church no longer exists today. And part of why that is, even though it's in a metropolitan area, it's in Nashville, Tennessee, that area, it had more to do with the fact of, rather than a social economic change, it had more to do with the fact of the neighborhood around that church and the drastic changes it went through over time. And so there's a lot of ways that this could be affected. And I think that's one of the points that can be made. In that specific case, that was the place to live about 70 years ago. Then, because of a lot of different factors socially, that became the place you didn't want to live. And that's really where it was when I was there. But because of the people, quite frankly, it was still a large church at the time, what we consider large, about 120. Because of that, and the people that still lived in that community for 50 years, it still existed. And now what's happened interestingly enough, is that community has revitalized, but it's revitalized with a demographic that was not, while the economic part was better, the social part was not as supportive of a church. And all those things change. So there's a lot of factors.
Right.
And the church let me say this as well, the church I was just moved from in Memphis, a long time before I moved there, they had, not a long time, but shortly before I moved there, had moved because of the changes in the community, that they had moved 10 miles further down the road because of the social changes within the communities outside of Memphis. There's a lot of things that changed that caused that. And as you said, there's nothing wrong with that. Although I will say what is sometimes wrong is our approach, that we fail to recognize that. We sometimes want to put blinders on to the changes around us.
Right, and I'll add one more thing. A group that I am really closely tied to no longer meets. The Remington Drive Church of Christ in Sunnyvale, California, as a new convert, as a new Christian, vibrant congregation, fabulous elders, very active in many ways. The group was attendance bounced between 150 and 250 over the years that I was connected to it, and it's right in the heart of Silicon Valley. It's actually, I think, really close to Google and Apple's campuses now. But that building, folks could become attached to its structure, but the numbers started to drop for a very simple reason. New families simply could not afford to move in and buy into the community. The price of housing in that community skyrocketed so fast that the jobs that were available to a young person could not keep up. The son of one of the deacons in that congregation, he got a job as a local police officer, and his entire paycheck paid their mortgage, on an annual basis. You think about how that kind of plays out and affects a new hire. Eventually your wage might increase and all those things will shift, but you're going to make a choice to say, I can't live there. I want to be able to have food on the table. Before I left to go to Florida College, the 2-bedroom apartment that we were living in there, the rent, and this was back in 1992, I think the rent was like $1,000 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment above a Vietnamese restaurant. I mean, you start doing some connections and that's on the El Camino, not in a great area. Those changes happen, but you've got to be proactive rather than reactive. One of the things I see in local churches is they don't forecast the future and pay attention enough to very easy to see things to say, hey, let's, rather than getting to a point that we're terrified and we don't know what to do and things aren't going well, let's be proactive in a way to say, hey, this is a change that's coming and we're going to embrace the change and we're going to know about the change and actually ride the top of the wave rather than getting swamped and churned in the chum of the crashing waves around them. And I think a lot of congregations, preachers, evangelists, elders, we don't respond well to that. We tend to freak out rather than plan how to move out, if you will. And this is my.
Let me say this, Phil. I think it's interesting that in some of those places people can't afford or don't want to live, they're more willing to move their family out of those neighborhoods and yet still cling to the churches in the same neighborhood. Sometimes we can personally see the reasons and justifications that change has to happen, but then when it comes to our affiliation with that home congregation and the history and legacy and the memories of it, we don't release the same way that we do personally, which is an interesting factor in all of this.
Yeah, and here's an easy way. There's a couple of easy metrics you can use, and they exist in the business century. They exist in social research and economic research, which is a side hobby of mine. I kind of get excited about stuff like this at times, maybe too much so. But pay attention to this, especially if you live on the edge of an urban zone, and look at where the Walmarts are, look at where the Dollar Generals are, and then look at how the churches are dispersed in an equivalent context, in the sense of their size, their engagement in the community, their methodology for engaging in the community. There's a reasonable path that each of these two industries use to serve the markets they choose to participate in. They've got some really specific mathematical models that help them decide where are we going to put one of our boxes. And it's not just economics. It's not just how much somebody makes. It's also economics related to where all the other stores are. And pretty much, here's a simplest, there's a lot more details to this, but I'm trying to break it down in the simplest way. If you're a house and you drive from your house and the first thing you see is a Dollar General and then you see a Walmart, there's a simple reason. The Dollar General knows that they can sell you things at a slightly higher price that you're willing to buy, that you're going to stop at because you need them more. And the things they don't sell are all the stuff that Walmart sells. You need that stuff too. And Walmart is willing to sell it at a price maybe even slightly higher than other options because they know that they have it all together. You go there and you're going to get their bargain basement prices and you're going to pay premium and the other stuff because it's all there. But you need all that stuff. It's all stuff you got to have in your life. Now, with that as a really like paper thin illustration of a much more complex mathematical model, social model, economic model, all that stuff, think about the way churches move. There are churches that exist in the Dollar General context, close to small communities, and they are able to provide a lot of what God offers. And sometimes we need those things. Like we desperately need that spiritual connection, but we do so at an exchange of what would be available if we drove twice as far to get what the Walmart has, that God also wants us to have at times too, like elders, vibrant Bible classes. And you and I have seen families make these choices over the years where they live because of their jobs, because of where they were raised, because of their families out in the middle of nowhere. Not really, but let's just say it is. And they'll drive 45 minutes each way to worship every time the church assembles because of what they need spiritually. And I thought it would be important for us to talk about how local churches maybe could approach some of these things in a healthier way. And Terry, maybe and I'm okay with being as specific as need be, especially in the positive sense. Right here's a great kind of transition because we talk about what this means. There are communities that are served by smaller congregations that are wonderfully receptive to their reality. And I'm thinking about places like Sevierville, Tennessee, Gulf Shores, Alabama, that understand that part of their service in the kingdom is being a place of refuge for brethren who are maybe on vacation or traveling through. Terry, have you met groups like that over the years? I want to talk about that kind of at the top of our list a little bit before we get into some nuts and bolts.
Absolutely. We've worshiped with the church in Sevierville a lot because the mountains are a favorite destination of Tennesseans and people in the Southeast. We like to go up there. I think one of the things to point out about that that's pretty interesting is that church was started for that purpose. In fact, part of the motivation was a benefactor that helped get that started who didn't even live in the area but saw a need for that church to exist for exactly what we're talking about. So they began with that purpose, and it's very similar to the Dollar General. I'm always amazed. I'll be driving, especially in Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi. One of the things about Dollar General, if you've not seen it before, you'll notice it now, is you're driving out in the middle of nowhere. There's literally nothing around for miles, and there's a Dollar General. And from a standpoint of they are very clever in that they know if you need milk and they sell milk, you can drive 15 miles to Walmart to buy a gallon of milk, or you can drive 3 miles to Dollar General. And you may pay 50 cents more, but you're willing to pay that because of the convenience and because, let's be honest, it's still cheaper than driving that far. And I've lived in places where it was a 15-minute drive to Walmart and Dollar General is right down the road. And that's what they're very successful at that. Well, in that sense, Sevierville is kind of the same way. You go to Gatlinburg area and you are there as a visitor. You can drive back into Knoxville and you can go there and you can worship there. But it's going to take about 40 minutes to get to church there if the traffic's good, because Knoxville always has road construction. Or there's a church there in Sevierville. You can also go to Crosby, which is another one that's close, for those who are familiar. Don't want to forget them. That's existed much longer, but again, you got to go over the mountain. It's a little bit harder to go, but here's a convenient place to go right here. And so there's a need for that. Gulf Shores, you mentioned Gulf Shores, Branson, Missouri. There's a lot of places who exist, and you go there and you will see more visitors than normal members every week. It's not unusual. It's not unusual at Sevierville for you to show up and be asked to lead prayer, maybe lead singing, depending on the week.
Teach class.
Preach. But they know who they are.
Yeah.
And I think there's a place for that. And if you know that's who you are, and that's the place. And look, there's a lot of places that are not tourist attractions where there is a need for those, what we would call Dollar General churches. That I've had family that lived in Boston, and you could drive an hour to an hour and a half either to the north or the south and go to church. But there was, for a long time, no church in Boston itself, which is hard to fathom. I think there was at time a small group that met in Boston. I don't know if they still exist, to try to alleviate. There's a need for that from a church standpoint. So I think we want to make sure and put out there, and I want to be very careful about this, that there is a need for those places to exist, especially in those country or parts of our country where there's an hour, 2 hour drive to what we would call Walmart. There's a need for that mentality.
Right. And, you go out to the West Coast where communities are farther apart and local bodies of Christians that we're connected to are going to be farther apart. I know brethren, I'm related to some of them, who their regular practice over the years growing up was 35-minute drive, 45-minute drive to services every time. And that was the nearest group of Christians to where they lived. And so it wasn't a question of, well, we're going to skip over places. It was, this is the closest to us. And we would love to have something closer, but the statistics around us don't support that. There's not enough people. And more so than that, there's not enough hearts interested in spiritual things to produce a vibrant, healthy congregation. This is not about evangelism. This is about maturing disciples, which is actually also part of evangelism in other senses, but it's a part of the process. And sometimes we get that process out of order. So you start thinking about that and this correlation between, let's set aside whatever we want to call reasonable, smaller communities of Christians, that there's a reason. And when I say by reason, I don't mean we don't like the people down the road. Like there's a reason that they need to be there. So let's set those to the side, all the good reasons as to whatever they may be. And let's talk about some of the consequences of bad reasons that are kind of interrelated to this. And by bad reasons, I'm going to lay them out there. Factious brethren, preachers who don't want to lose their job, individuals who are attached to the brick and mortar instead of Christ, individuals who attach to a family heritage rather than what would genuinely be good for the kingdom of God. And I will lay this out there in a very plain way. I'm passionate about this, about churches existing within a relatively close distance to one another that are half of what they could be in light of what God needs them to be. And we'll hopefully get some specifics in there to lay it out and maybe challenge people to rethink some ideas. Terry, I know we've talked about this.
Yeah, let me use the store analogy because I think it's something people can understand. There's some places where there's $4 Generals within like a 5-mile radius where there could be one Walmart.
Yeah.
And why that, we're not talking about size, we're talking about what you offer the kingdom and the community. That there's 4 small churches that if they would come together, they would be one larger size church, which gives you not only more fellowship and encouragement with each other, but also the ability to even do more evangelistically and to do that in a way that's more effective. I'll go a step further. There are some places where there's 4 Walmarts in a 5-mile radius where there could be a Sam's Club. Right. And we've not talked about that, but a Sam's Club is actually a place that is even larger than Walmart with better services and better offerings that you actually pay money to be a part of for the opportunity to walk into the doors. And so there's this such and not that we should charge admission to the church, that's not the point, but there is such a benefit to being a member at Sam's that you're willing to pay for it. That's how much it means to you to have that opportunity. What we fail to see is that sometimes there actually is a need for less churches that will then provide churches that have more ability, not larger, but more ability is what the way to think of that.
Right, and I want to clarify something. Terry and I are not talking about the normative participation of the bodies that are there. Like, are there 50 people there? Are there 70 people there? Are there 250 people there? Are there 500? Are there 1,000? That's not, I mean, that's related, but that's not our point. Our point is, what does God want us to do, and who does he want us to be? And if you guys live in the same town and follow the same God and profess the same Christ, but do not worship together and maybe don't even know each other, I'm going to tell you straight up, something's wrong.
Or maybe you know each other and you don't really like each other. I mean, that's really wrong. I mean, I think we can go to that as well. But look, if we all want to go to heaven together, but we all want to worship together, there's something odd about that.
Right. And I'll just say it's sin at many times, at many levels. And it could be individual rebellion. It can be preacher-led rebellion. It could be leadership-led rebellion. There are layers of sin that exist if you cannot worship with brethren who believe the same spiritual truths. I get it. If there's a real legitimate doctrinal connection that you guys are struggling to figure out, and I'll just say, these guys over there, they say Jews and Gentiles can't worship together. Got it. I understand why you're not with them, because that's wrong. They're racists. They literally believe people of different colors can't be in the kingdom of God, or even if they are, they're less. I'll just say those are sins that have to be rebuked. And rather than participate in the problem, be plain. You say, we're not part of that church because that church is full of racists, and I ain't none of that. And that's okay, because that's what God is, in essence, teaching us to do, is to separate sin from convenience in order to achieve harmony in spiritual things. And unity itself, like Laura brings up, how that's a powerful tool of evangelism. It absolutely is. And disunity breaks the heart of God, and it really breaks down your ability to be effective. And I'll talk about effectiveness in a couple of ways that everyone wants, but no one wants to do the changes necessary to get. Everyone wants elders. How far are you willing to drive to create an eldership?
Yeah.
Everybody wants great Bible classes. What are you willing to do to make your Bible classes better for the visitors, for the adults, for the kids? Everyone wants kids their own age in the congregation they're part of. Okay, how do you fix that? Because you don't control evangelism. You don't control the increase that God gives. You have zero control over that. You have every ounce of control how you handle all those other things. And practically and passionately, we have to get beyond the idea that I can't function in a church bigger than a Dollar General or a Walmart or a Sam's Club, and think about, how can I function in a way that pleases God? I think there's a powerful thing there.
Hal Hammond said, Henry Ford has split more churches than any other man. It's so easy for dissatisfied Christians today to get in the car and go somewhere else. I want to offer a different approach to that, Hal. I know places where Henry Ford had nothing to do with the existence of so many churches. It was actually the horse and buggy that still to this day exists. That you can look in parts of our country where some of those churches existed a horse ride apart. I know that from living in one of those places where you actually see the carriage stops for them to get out of the carriages in front of the buildings. What is interesting is that when the opportunity for the car to actually combine those churches to drive further, there's a lot of places that have never done that as well. And I think in the issue of dissatisfied Christians who are leaving and going somewhere else, I do have a problem with it. I will say this. I think sometimes we're harsh on people who drive by smaller churches, drive by Dollar General to go to Walmart because of what they get there, and we take that as a slight and we judge them for that. And they may be right in that. They could be doing the right thing. And I know that sounds harsh, but if you were driving past a Dollar General store, let's say you're a family of 5 like me, you have 3 kids, the church that is closest to you has no leadership, no elder. Their teaching is not great. Their classes for your kids are non-existent. So if your kids go there, they're going to be a class by themselves or in a class together. There's a lot of factors. Would I make the decision to drive past that church, to have leadership classes, to have the opportunity to make sure that my children grow up in education spiritually in those classes? that strengthens what they're learning at home, that helps them learn discipleship, absolutely I will do that. Absolutely I would do that in a heartbeat. And I think, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think Phil agrees with me, in those cases, that is the right decision because it is what
Right.
is needed.
Right, and you have to balance it out and realize that it's not just about other kids being there. That's not the
Right.
issue. It's a factor. It's probably the smallest of the factor. It's asking the question, does the leadership of the group that I want to be part of, whether there's elders or not, do they have a vision that allows me to grow spiritually? I want to tear down a straw man really quick. One of the straw men that exists is, well, if I go to a Dollar General smaller group with limited things, I can do more. That's a straw man.
Yeah.
You can do as much as you want to do in either context. As the group grows, actually the work multiplies. There's more to do having been in a big group than in a small group because there's more people there.
Here's the problem with what you're saying there. What was really meant by that is I get to lead singing more at the small church.
Right.
That is restricting the work you see to the public aspect of the work that we see. It's restricting it to the leadership. The real work to be done in churches doesn't happen in the auditorium in front of people. The real work of encouraging the fellowship, the teaching, the private counseling, teaching, the mentoring, all of that grows exponentially as the church grows. Larger churches have more work to be done because they have more problems because they have more people. So the idea that a small church has more work for me to do is actually a false concept. As you grow, you need more workers because you have more people. And so that's one of the things. It is definitely a straw man. The reason we do, here's what's funny about that. That is said most often. That is the promotional propaganda of the smaller churches to try to get people to not drive past their building to go to the large church. What's really counterproductive about that is if you're successful in getting those people to stop, suddenly you're going to find out you're a big church. And now what you've become is the very thing you said you didn't want to be, which is pretty interesting as well.
Right. And I'll make a couple of quick points. Mathematically speaking, I can say with confidence that most of the Christians I know have never really been part of a large church, from both what the Bible calls large, if you want to say it calls something large, in Acts chapter 2, and what the world calls large around us. They have actually been part of very small assemblies of Christians. And so they don't have an experience that goes beyond that. And how asks a great question. How do we initiate a conversation about which some people very derogatorily will refer to as sheep stealing? But that's what he's talking about. How do you get someone to go from Dollar General to Walmart to Sam's Club? I'll tell you, I've talked to people who've made the shift, and you present to them the spiritual value of being together. And some people don't want to do it, and it may not have the outcome you're looking for. But if you're not moving in a way that builds people together in Christ in the best way possible in the communities you're part of, you're missing out on a component. And so starting that conversation is going to be hard because people don't like change.
I think one of the ways that sometimes it needs to happen is the leadership of those two places talking together. If you are at a Dollar General church or a Walmart church, but you become passionate that this needs to happen, then I think one of the ways they can start is rather than talking to members, which I think is again, the sheep stealing comment is there, and I'm very cautious about that. But there is a place to go, maybe preacher to preacher if you know them, or your elders talk to their elders if they have them, or your elders talk to some of their men of saying, hey, look, God can be glorified more if we come together. I got to tell you, when that happens, one of the problems is sometimes we let all the wrong factors determine whether we should. I heard of a story one time where two churches talked about coming together, and there was a lot of reception to it until it came down to which geographic location they were going to meet at. And all because both wanted to stay at their certain geographic location. Everything else was fine until it came to which building do we keep, And to this day, those two churches don't meet together, all because of the brick and mortar location. And let me ask you a question about that, just to think about. Did that glorify God to hold on to geography that much? I mean, here we had this opportunity to create a larger group that has more impact, but we didn't because of brick and mortar. I think sometimes you're going to have to be willing to get past some of those attachments that Phil talked about earlier.
You gotta let them go and realize, how it was in the past should not necessarily mandate how it is now and how it will be in the future. Here's an illustration. I've got a friend of mine who's just fantastic. And one of the things he was talking about is in his upbringing and his spouse's upbringing, they're part of smaller groups of Christians just because of where they live. And their families, their brothers and sisters and all of that were kind of expected to greet people when they came to services. It says being part of a large church, we don't always get to do that. And I said, well, that's awesome. And I think that's great. And maybe there's a way you can accomplish that in your large church context. If you've got kids, make it a demand, an expectation that if a family comes in, they don't know, and they've got kids, those kids invite their kids to sit together.
Right.
And boom, now they've done the thing, and they're showing leadership in that congregation that's inclusive and connected. And now they're doing the thing you remember doing in a way that serves the community you're part of now. And so you get both. You get your experience from your youth magnified in your children. And that's kind of what we want as parents anyway. Like as a parental level, we want them to do the things we did that were good for us spiritually, but do them better.
Right.
Do it like we did, but you do a better version of it. And so all those things are things that are part of this. How do you have that conversation starting? So starting from the leadership level. If you're an elder and you look to the future and you say, hey, our community is kind of dying off, let's scout out the land and be an elder and shepherd this flock and chart a course that says tomorrow will look better than today. If you're an evangelist and maybe you're in that leadership role, maybe you're a deacon, do that same conversation internally and say, are we open to these things? Why are we not open to them? Are there things where we need to teach about so people can see about what this can look like? No elders, no deacons. I'll just tell you straight up, you need elders and deacons. And before you do anything else, you should be looking at ways that will get you as a flock of God to that point. And maybe you can't band together to make that happen. Maybe you need to grow them internally, but you figure that out. And if it means that you can band together to have leadership in your congregation, instantly you are more like God wants you to be. If you've got qualified men serving as elders, you're now more in line with God's expectation than you were yesterday. And geography doesn't matter.
And let me add to that. A lot of churches exist, especially I'm in Alabama, and there's history behind why there's so many churches. What I find interesting about that is a lot of the people involved in that history are no longer with us. And I think even in those cases, when you're part of those churches that have split and divided over the years, and you know the history, but those individuals are no longer there, and maybe those issues are no longer present, what would glorify God more than those two places coming back together? What would be more like God's picture of reconciliation than two churches reconciling after being apart for so long? And I think those are things like that we kind of need to think about that. So
here's a question that popped up, and I think it's important for us to, it seems like you guys are encouraging people to leave or skip over smaller congregations instead of driving to other towns and communities. Why not grow where you're planted? That's a great question, and there's some components to that. We talked about that early on, that there are some contexts where that smaller group is essential and is necessary. Some of what we're talking about is in tightly packed communities, often in the Southeast, where you're going to have 4 or 5 churches in one town. And the town may only number as a group 30,000 people. And so in that town of 30,000, you have 3 churches that are geographically 2 miles from one another. Like the whole thing of having $4 generals, and you can drive 3 minutes from each of them, in the same community. Dollar General has a great mathematical model, and often they don't do that unless there's a lot of people, to justify that offering. In congregational contexts, you are simply missing out if you don't at least ask the question. But I'll add this, skipping over smaller congregations, there's reasons why people would do that, legitimate biblical ones. Not talking about things we don't get along, but real talking about, hey, there's a spiritual vacuum in my life, and this place provides what I need, which might be leadership. It might be great Bible teaching or great preaching. And those things matter, especially when it comes to raising a family.
Yeah, and let
And
me let me use the planted illustration. I think what we're talking about sometimes is we're not talking about skipping over smaller churches and so forth. What we're saying is that churches in those areas should be full-grown plants rather than staying seedlings forever. And I think that's the issue is um, if you can help that church grow and you can help that church in that community, the church, become more of a plant that is fruitful than just staying a seedling, then yes, do that. But now what if you go there and you encounter that church's mindset is to never get beyond the seedling? It's purely in maintenance mode. If for whatever reason there's no leadership, there's no desire for leadership, there's no desire for growth, there's nothing going on. In that case, where that church in that case has gone into maintenance mode and quite frankly is not glorifying God because of what they're not doing. Would I say that you should drive past that church to go to a church that is growing and is glorifying God? I would do that personally. Let me say it that way.
yeah, and we're looking at it from a multifaceted perspective. We're looking at it from a leadership level. We're looking at it from a preacher level, which is inclusive in leadership at times, but also just on a family level. Like, what's good for my soul and what will enrich my connection to God? And again, I don't know if Scott or Amy, which of the two of you are watching, or both of you together, doesn't matter. But I'll add this little tidbit. One of the things you mentioned before is if you've got people who worship the same God, follow the same Christ in the same town, and don't know each other because they can't or won't worship together, that's some of the things we're talking about. And that's a problem that needs to be addressed. And that's part of our, context here. Because eventually, if the congregation you're part of continues to drop down because maybe there's been no new additions to the body of Christ in 20 years, that's a sign that there's something going on, that God is not granting increase. So maybe there's not sowing taking place. Maybe there's some other factors that have to be evaluated and considered. And so the statement, which is very kind of resounds in your head of growing where you're planted, is true. And they went about everywhere scattered and they shared the word. But if people aren't sharing the word, then there's not going to be any growth. And you may look at it and say, wait a minute, I actually need to be here in order to help someone. Because there's one more clause to this. It's not just about what you get. It may be that by making a decision like this, you become the beginning of an eldership for a congregation because you decided to commit yourself to spread out your wings a little bit and go 25 miles versus 12 miles as your stomping ground. And now a congregation that has never had elders has one because you made that choice. Or maybe it's as small as you make that choice and you keep someone in the fold of God that may have been left behind because you understand them and nobody else does. And I say small as narrow of application to one soul for one day. All of these things are factors you have to consider. And if you don't consider them and you just kind of blindly continue with, well, I'm going to keep doing this because this is what I know, there's some richness of association in the kingdom that you're missing out on. I know that that's hard to digest from someone who has been in congregations on the edge of communities and maybe in places where there are too many churches in the community. And it's distressing to have brethren in the town where you're at not be able to worship together, that believe all the same things, practice all the same things, but have some structural, emotional, or made up reason as to why they can't worship together. And that's part of also what we're kind of getting at in this connected aspect of what's going on and what's there and what we maybe would want to step to a better way. Beyond that, we've already talked about a lot, and we try to keep these things short, and we're kind of past the short time frame here. Um, I want to add this. One of the things that's important is for people to realize that they have an option in all of this. They can be part of a solution in a local church or part of a problem in a local church. The shift is, which one do you want to be? You may very well be the reason a church is not growing because you're not willing to grow, just as much as you might be the very reason that a church that has never grown will grow. And so you've got to make a choice in that area that's going to be good for the kingdom. And that's why we're at kingdom level with that conversation, no longer about what's good for my kids.
Well, let me also say there's one aspect to that too, that I know of a situation where there was a guy that was a part of what we would call a Dollar General church for quite a while. And he eventually saw that that was not what was best for him, for the kingdom. And so he came to what we would describe as a Walmart church. But he also brought not all, but the majority of the Dollar General folks with him. And their lives were greatly enriched. You can make a difference sometimes in ways you don't understand. And I know there are some people who are still faithful today because of that transition who would not have been, and don't ask me how I know that because that's too personal, but who would not have been had it not been for that change. And so to Scott or Amy's question, there's also this part that maybe you are a part of a smaller church, but you see in the conversation, hey, there's $4 generals here. We could glorify God more if we all came together. Maybe you're the one that starts that conversation. And that's part of why we want to have this discussion today is in some places that does need to happen.
Right. And look, and people may not agree with us. And, Terry and I don't agree with each other sometimes. I think this is one of the ones where I think we do kind of have a similar mindset, maybe not always the same solution to it. But this is really important. It's important for us as believers in God to get into a context and a situation where we can be of the best use to the kingdom. And maybe that's in a smaller community, and maybe that's in a bigger group. But maybe it's just in the simple sense of saying, where does God need me? And with that shift, where are the people that I am most responsible for get the most they need? And that's part of this equation too. There's a lot more that goes into this than just big church, little church, more Bible class, little less Bible classes, all those kind of structural things. It's about understanding that God needs us to be together as believers. You want to watch someone struggle spiritually, get them into smaller and smaller settings where there's less and less brethren around them to encourage them outside of the assembly. Because as Terry and I know that we agree, that's the primary breeding ground for great spiritual strength. It's taking what you learned in the assemblies, whatever they are, and experiencing it in your day-to-day interactions and engaging in it in a healthy way.
Absolutely.
Terry, you got anything else? I think it's probably good for us to shelve some of the stuff that we might include for future conversations here at this point, given,
Sure.
We've already kind of covered quite a long time. I really want to add this. I really appreciate all your questions. They're excellent to kind of redirect things and to bring stuff up that maybe we weren't putting at the top of our agenda for the conversation, and keep those coming. We've got still a very long backlog of ideas of things that we want to talk about. We got some stuff coming up, and I want you to talk about next Tuesday real quick.
Yeah, next Tuesday, we're going to have Luke Adams join us. Luke is, full disclosure, Luke was the ring bearer at my wedding, so I have known him for most of his life. Luke is actually has a degree in public relations marketing and works in that field. And has done a lot of stuff as far as marketing goes secularly, but he's also been involved in that spiritually. And so we've asked Luke to join us next Tuesday and to talk about some of those things, some of the do's and don'ts about how to market a church. What about logos and branding? Is that something that's effective? And even maybe get into a little bit of some of the things we talked about today, which is how does those social, economic, cultural things impact how you even market? Does a church in a smaller area, do they market differently than a church in a more urban area? And so we're looking forward to that. I don't know how much that we'll be able to cover, but look forward to tapping into Luke's knowledge and to spend some time with him. And so looking forward to that. Luke's a good friend of mine, and hope you can join us next Tuesday. That'll be at 10 o'clock at our regular time.
Right, and last bits here. We've taken a majority of our past videos and placed them on YouTube, so you can find us there. It doesn't have its own channel. They're just kind of archived on my personal stuff. There's a link on the Facebook page. I know some people have been asking about sharing these outside of Facebook. Great way to do that. But it's going to be archives, not actual live recordings. So it's just a place to kind of, hey, I saw this video, maybe you want to take a look at it. So that's Phillip W. Martin on YouTube. But if you just Google Do the Work, I think it actually comes up, or they search Do the Work inside of YouTube. They should pop up there.
Yeah, and let me say real quick.
Thank everyone for joining us. Oh.
Yeah, another thing is I've had a lot of people come up lately and just thank us for this. And I just want to thank of those of you that are watching and your kind words privately to us. I know it's encouraging to me. I'm sure it is to Phil. And so we just appreciate that. And if we could be assistance even privately in any way in some of these things, reach out to us. We'd love to do that. What really is at the core of what we're trying to do in all of this, and even discussions today that may be a little bit more controversial in some ways than some people want to hear, is we're wanting to glorify God by this and strengthen churches and leadership. And so if we can do that in any way, either publicly or privately, that's our goal together.
Yeah. Hey, everybody, have a great day. Thanks, Terry. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. And you take care of yourselves out there. It's a rough world, but God has a great plan.